Alright, so here's the next project we're working on, a Sporran bag. This will attach on the front of your belt. It'll attach to belt loops on your kilt through your pants. But I also will be including these tabs so you can attach these to any belt you might already have. So you don't have to rely just on the belt loops. It's got a separate zipper pocket for cards and things, and on the inside here there's a separate D-ring that's attached to the bottom of the lid, so you can attach keys or what have you to that, so you know they're real secure in there. But I did a cool little way that I attached this flap. You can see right on that edge it seems to look a little cleaner. Just a neat little way that I've been doing lids for a while now on my disc golf bags. But I'll show you how to do that in the video. You can make this out of 4 to 6 ounce veg tan. I prefer like a 4 or 5. You can also use a chrome tan, but I would still suggest for like the billets and things, do a veg tan, something that's got a little more rigidity to it. And thanks to the people at the Leather Crafters and Saddlers Journal for sponsoring my videos. Great publication, great people. They put on shows throughout the year. They really do a lot for the leather crafting community. I suggest checking out their publication, looking into their shows, go to their website. Okay, I'm taping together the pattern. What I'll do is just grab a big piece of tape and I put it so just barely the edge of it is on my table. And then I come in with scissors and just cut it right up to the table in strips. And I do this so I don't have to sit and pull little teeny pieces off one at a time. All you have to do is grab a piece and pull it straight up, and it'll finish tearing across that tape right there. So then you can just sit, use it, and just grab the piece as you need them. I have a video covering how I tape patterns together and how I make them reusable, if you want to go check that out. One of the things I do is I'll get the ends like here and here lined up and put a piece of tape right there, because then you can still get a little bit of play in the middle, so you can make sure everything's just right before you work these ends together. See, when I cut these pattern parts out, I cut close to the line but not on it. That way I can tape these down to the leather, and then when it's all, the holes are punched and everything else is cut out from the inside, I can cut right on that line with my knife. It's a lot easier to follow that line than it is the edge of a pattern. Alright, so I got my pattern all cut out. I'll punch all the holes and then I'll cut it out. But what I like to do is tape it down real good, and anywhere there's holes or something to be cut out, I make sure there's tape over that. It keeps the paper from stretching around, especially when you start punching holes and stuff. So since you need every one of these holes punched out in that location they're marked, you can go through with lacing chisels. You just have to make sure that when you have something like this, it helps versus the round ones. But when you have a part, you don't want to every hole have this turned different ways. You want to use that flat edge and make sure it's straight every time, so that angle of that hole is just right. And as you're going around corners, make sure you follow the line of the pattern itself and turn this tool as you're punching these holes. Same with this one, there's a flat edge on that. Just make sure you're following. But I'm probably just going to go with a standard hole punch on this one. You'll notice the holes on this pattern are just a tiny bit bigger than this 1/16 inch hole punch, so when you're using this, it's a lot easier to center it right in that hole because you'll see the edges of it. So what I do, especially if the parts are really close together, trying to get the most yield out of a piece of leather, I'll punch all the holes and then cut this part out and then continue on. Because if I start just, okay, I'm going to cut all these parts into separate pieces before I punch holes and stuff, then everywhere it's close, this is only going to be half the distance of leather holding that part down to the leather with tape. So if I wait and just cut this out, then I'm still utilizing whichever space I have left where it's taped down to the leather. Then also where I'm cutting out holes for buckles, I'll punch 2 holes. In this case I used a 13/64 hole punch. I'll butt this right up against the edge of the hole and start cutting along those lines, but I'll come out towards the center a little bit and then do the same from that side, because I can always trim a little bit if there's anything left. But if I accidentally come out and go too wide, there's nothing you can do. You can always cut more off. So after cutting that part, you can see I still have a good amount of leather in between there holding these other parts on. Not as crucial here. I could have probably cut the parts all out before I punched them and did the final cut. But sometimes I don't have much leather, and if it's real close, this is how I do it. After you cut these parts out, make sure you're keeping the templates, because if you're getting to that point where you're starting to sew stuff together, you may need to lay these back down and mark where these center holes are. You'll notice a lot of these parts will have a line marking the dead center, so you can just lay this back on your part, mark the center on parts that are sewn together, and start on that hole. That way you know everything will be lined up just right. So just make sure you hold on to these templates. Just set them aside as you're cutting stuff out. I like to give a lot of tips in my videos. I may repeat myself quite a bit, but there's always going to be ones that aren't in this video that will be in another one. So if you want to try to get as many tips as you can, I suggest watching my other videos, even if you don't have the pattern for that particular video. If you watch it, there's going to be all kinds of tips and things that may not be in one or the other. So I got all the holes punched in this piece, and I started cutting it out. And then once I get around this side, I'll pull it away, pop this up, and cut it out to make it easier. But when I cut it out, I don't go straight from the end of that cut. I always go up from this end of that cut so that I don't mess up this area right here. Now I can get right back in there and make sure that cut stays nice and clean. First thing I'm going to do is put the zipper in this zipper slot here. I like to just go ahead and use this double stick tape to put my zippers on. If you're doing oil dye, don't use this stuff. The oil dye reacts with the adhesive and it gets all gummy and oozy. You can glue these. I just like to use this tape, because then I can just get right to it, start, don't have to wait for glue to dry. Although that glue does holds a little bit better while you're trying to sew this on, and the needles won't get gummy with the glue. But this works for me. But have the zipper pushed all the way to the one side so the zipper's zipped closed. So when I lay this on here, I have that zipper all the way to that one end. And I'm not stretching the zipper, but with this hand I'm holding it just snug enough to hold it straight so there's no slack. And I work across, making sure it's good and straight. Press it down real good. So I'm going to cut this excess off, but I feel underneath where the end is, kind of see where the holes are, and you're better off leaving a little bit extra. You can always cut some off if you need to. I think I'll leave that and trim that after I sew this on. So I show in most of my videos how I thread a needle. So I put the thread through the needle and then I came back on the thread and went right through the center of it, so it locks it in there. You might be sewing and have to retighten it a little bit, but you don't have to struggle nearly as much. To find the holes, a lot of times I'll just pop a hole from the front so I can see it on the back side. What I'll do is I'll throw this in my stitching pony to speed things along so it'll hold it for me. But basically what I'm going to be doing is coming through the back side and always holding it down or towards the inside, towards the zipper, and coming on the same side of that thread as I go back every time, so the stitches have that angle to them and they look real nice like a machine stitch. So here's how I do that. To speed it up, I always use that needle to make that hole since it isn't in the zipper itself, and then I'll grab the other needle and flip it around, and I'm holding that thread down as the front needle goes through. Make the hole, follow that needle back through, and I grab it with this needle in my hand and turn and hold this down so this one is on top of that thread every time going back through the other way. And when you get good at this, you get a good rhythm going. You can really cruise through some stuff. Okay, I got the zipper sewn on. I'm going to get the flap ready here. So first thing we need to do is sew this little D-ring on. I got the D-ring sewn to the back of the lid here. You want to make sure the flesh side is what looks good. Might seem counterproductive, but since we're going down like this, that's going to be hidden back behind there. That's to like clip keys and whatever, that'll sit inside the pocket there. So when you sew the lid on, you notice there's extra holes, and you want the same amount of holes on each side of that. And I think I'm going to get rid of this extra hole here on the pattern. I don't think I need that. But we're going to sew across the lid right here. Don't do the decorative stitches across here yet, because you can see these notches cut out. It's kind of an interesting design I've done for a while now on my disc golf bags, and I'll show you how I do that. I like how they sit. It looks a little bit fancier. So next we're going to sew this down to here, and again make sure you have the same number of holes on each side. I started sewing the lid on, and I'm not going across the edge right here. I'm going to wait and do that when I sew that big pocket on. I'll start across that edge just to kind of help solidify this whole area right here, and then I'll go around and then come across that edge there on the other side. The flap is sewn on. Okay, I'm going to sew the gusset. Sew the gusset onto the front of the pocket. The gusset will be going behind that, like so. What I like to do, since I sealed this, a lot of times I won't seal the gussets, so they stay a little softer. I'll work with them a little bit, especially if I'm using an oil dye. But what I'll do, just kind of work with this a little bit, just to try to get it to want to be in that shape, and also to be a little more workable. Maybe give it just a tiny spray. Just a tiny bit of water. Another thing I do sometimes, if I got sharp corners to go around, I'll take a wool dauber and just put a little water on the edge like I was going to slick the edge. Not too much, I don't want water going into the holes. But just a little bit, because then it helps that compress and get around corners and things. But just that little bit of moisture is going to help this form into the shape that we want it in. I like to go around the edges one time just to hold them together a little bit better. First couple stitches are going to be a little tricky just to hold everything in place since it doesn't want to sit right. And same as before, I always come from behind here, and then that will go to the inside, and then this one will come to the outside of that thread every stitch. Well, you can see I got it in my stitching pony, and if you got a part that's hanging and getting in your way, what I'll do is I'll scoot my chair up to the table and set this part on the edge of the table. You can even put a little weight on it or something so it kind of holds it there for you while you're sewing around that corner. Make sure you pull these stitches good and tight. You may need to kind of direct this down around that corner. Get them stitches pulled good and tight. Otherwise you're going to see some underneath that front piece there. So as I'm coming around the corner, one little trick I like to do, and everybody kind of figures out their own way, is before I really try to pull these stitches tight, I'm wrapping my finger around it a couple times, and I'll push this down where I want it, pull this one tight, and then both. And it seems to kind of tuck it in there a little bit better. It gets a little cleaner. Probably not a huge difference, but I thought I'd mention that. Okay, I got the gusset on the front pocket on here. Now we're going to sew this strip around the other side of the gusset, like that, following the inside row of holes on this to the gusset. We want the two good sides facing each other, because once that's on there, the outside row of stitches is going to be sewn to the bag there. And since these stitches will be hidden, you don't have to worry about getting on the same side of each thread as after it comes through the other side. You want to pull these good and tight. Okay, the strip is sewn on there. I like to kind of press it down a little bit. Once it's flat, it'll lay good, but it will look a little weird until you start getting it sewn down to the main part there. So that part's done. Before we sew this to the back section that has the lid on there, you can see I already started, and I'll grab that video footage and put it after this. But we want to sew the buckle on there, and I just added a little bit of glue in here, lined up those holes, and put a clip on there to hold it while it dries. Once that's dry, we'll sew that to the pocket and then sew the pocket to that back panel. Alright, I'm going to sew this onto here, but what I'm going to do is start right in this corner hole, go around, and then meet back up in that corner, and then back stitch all the way back to here, so we get a good back stitch all the way across there. Since this buckle's on there tight, trying to lift this up, a little bit tricky if you're trying to lift this out of the way. So I just go right through the top of the buckle, make sure my threads are inside of the buckle. Then I don't have to try to lift the buckle out of the way. So I'm just sewing right through the center of it. I'm just going to back stitch all the way back across and then get back to sewing the pocket on here. And now this is the thread that's going to sew this on. And what I'm going to do is start in the last stitch for that cover piece there. And what I'm going to have to do is come up through that first stitch on the inside, not this outside one, but on the inside. So I'm going to pop up through there, and like I said, that hole in the middle, that third hole in between those two, that's an extra hole I'm going to take off the pattern. So this one, the next one off of the lid, is going to come in to here, inside of the pocket, through both of those pieces. And as always, it's tricky when you first start sewing a part on to hold everything in place. So this is the one that came up through the two. That's going to go back down through that last hole in the lid there. So right now it's just that stitch across that gap holding those two parts together and to the back piece. And this one's going to go down through this hole to the back. And again, make sure both of these are the same length. Now that I have that gap crossed, one of these is going to come up through the first hole in that little gusset piece. And the other one's going to come up through that second hole in the gusset piece. See how that's both coming up there? Now I'll just continue down and sew all the way around, and then when I get to this end, I'll come from behind and go across that gap just to lock everything in place and hold everything together. I'll point out too here, I don't cross the gap on the edge of this part. The stitching just starts in that first hole and comes down. What I'll do is I'll slide this past the edge of my table as I'm sewing along here. So I finished sewing all the way up this edge, and what I'm going to do before I pop across like we did on the other side is I'm just going to tie a knot in the back so I make sure nothing loosens up while I'm farting around. So that's the gussets all sewn onto that back piece. And now how we got that going across that gap right there, I'm going to pop up. So we're going to come across here and pop up through this hole where the gusset is attached to this part right here. So we're popping up right into that hole with one of the needles. And the other one's going to pop into the last one that the flap was sewn to. And then both these threads are just going to go across that gap and back through and then tie in the back. So then it holds that whole section down real well. Get rid of the excess, makes it a little easier to tie these knots. I'll put a little dab of glue on this knot too. And you can see there's two little flaps that aren't held down behind this gusset. What we're going to do is sew around the decorative stitches around the edge, but there's going to be a hole right there that it goes through to hold that little flap against the back of that. It just makes a real sharp looking edge right there. I've been sewing disc golf bags like that for quite some time now. Okay, we're going to do the decorative stitches around the perimeter of the lid there. But first, punch out these button looking parts. And you're going to put the thread through it. What that's going to do is allow you to go through the same hole with both of these threads. You might have wondered what this hole up above all these, so you'll have this straight row that the lid is sewn to, but up above it off to the side here was an extra hole. And we're going to come out with both of these ends through the same hole. And that's going to keep it from coming through. Now one of these threads have one of the threads go on top of the lid and one go underneath. And you'll just start going down the decorative holes across the perimeter of the lid there. You gotta pull them snug, but don't overly do it. See, it's coming out of that hole right there, and that's going to hold that edge up against there. It's going to look real nice when it's all done. Go around the edge and go back through that hole, and then use this one to tie a knot. Okay, I went all the way around the edge of the cover here, and I went through that last hole. Now this hole that's a little bit higher, it kind of seems out of place, is where that's going to go through. The top and the bottom one are going through that same hole. And that's going to hold that edge nice and clean right up against the back there. I'll go through twice. That first time to lock that in, so then it's not going to loosen up. And you just do two more standard box knot. And I'll put some glue on there. Now I'll do this. I'm going to start the decorative stitches right on that first hole that it's going to go through the lid to. Start right there, go around the edge and stop right there, and then finish up by sewing it down to that. Okay, you can see the first hole where it goes into the lid, attaches to the lid, is where I started stitching, went all the way around, and then that's the last hole where I had the thread come up from behind. So now this first thread that goes down, it's going to go down through that first hole on the side there. And then I'll just continue all the way around to here. And then I'll tie a knot and stuff it in between two of the stitches so it holds it in there. Okay, I'm just finishing up these last couple stitches here. So since that's that last hole, instead of coming all the way through, I'm going to come in between the two layers. And the same with this one. Come down between the two layers. Tie a knot. Make sure I get it good and tight. Make a little gap and start pushing it in there. I'm going to put a little dab of glue on the end of this needle too. Push that in there, put a little glue in there. So that can get loose right here. So I'll just go back and kind of pull some of that slack and even it out. Okay, that's all on there. So now putting this back piece on. Once that's sewn around the perimeter, we'll do these pieces. So before I sew these two together, like I mentioned, keep these pattern parts. The templates come in handy, so you can line all this up and it'll tell you which hole is that center hole. So you can mark that on both of these parts and start on that hole, so you know everything will be lined up just right. Cutting off the excess zipper. I just don't want that zipper to be in the way of these holes. Having a little excess on there is good though. So I started sewing right on that center hole because they were both marked. Once you get a couple of the holes done, I'd line everything up and throw a clip or a couple clips down at the bottom, and then I'll just put this off the edge of my table and go. Alright, so I went around the whole perimeter of those two main sections, and when I met up I tied a knot, stuffed it in between a couple stitches, add a little bit of glue in there. Next we'll put these tabs on here. So the last thing we have to do is put these clips on. And just take these tabs. Since they swivel, you don't got to worry about which side, but I still like to look and find which side looks better on the part and the clip itself and try to put that facing forward. Every once in a while you'll find something that's got a little scratch or something. So you'll just sandwich the bag in between there, and I'll just start right on one of the corners here. Make it easy to figure out all the holes so they're lined up properly. That way, starting just down here, I'll be able to tie a knot in the back and stuff it in between the two layers. Not have to worry about back stitching or any of that. If you want to do it that way, you could too, but whenever I can, I would prefer tying knots, so then it just looks cleaner. You don't have a bunch of back stitching and stuff. So you'll see as we get close to this edge, that third hole down from the corner, it's lined up with the stitches on these parts. So you'll be able to go through those, all the layers, using one of those holes from that seam. And then after that, this whole row here, and then one down from that corner, they're all only holding these two layers together off of these parts. It's real easy for this clip to fall back, and you could go on the wrong side of this post here, so make sure you're pulling this out of the way too. And check, because if it's got snagged by the thread, you're going to want to pull a couple threads, pull a couple stitches out. Whenever you're sewing a part that wants to kind of come apart and loosen the threads up, you're going to want to make sure you pull it tight with every stitch, and then like 5 or 6 stitches back it's going to stay tight, but these first few are going to loosen up every time. If I'm doing something like this border here, I'll go like 2 and sometimes even 3 stitches in a row and then snug them up, just to speed things along. Okay, I'm on the second to the last stitch, so this is going to go through these first couple layers, but it's going to pop out in between this back panel and this tab. And this one will just go through the tab on this side. I can tie the knot, tie a knot right there and stuff it in between those 2 stitches, put a little dab of glue in there, and then I'll do the other one. Now there are 2 other tabs. There are 2 other tabs that you can just put a D-ring in. They're the same as these ones. Put a D-ring in so you can attach them to a belt, any belt you have. But these can just be clipped to your belt loops on your kilt or a pair of pants or what have you.